And thanks very much to Katie for the invite to talk about Cenozoic Scottish fossils. So the question really is, where are all the Scottish mammoths? Why do we not have as many mammoths in Scotland as we do find in England and Wales, and even in Ireland, essentially, which has a whole bunch of really good fossil sites too. So here's the kind of format for today. It's going to be a bit meandering. Hopefully that'll give lots of avenues for potential questions at the end. But first of all, I'm going to talk a bit about me, why I should be listened to at all, what my background is, a little bit of background as well about Cenozoic Scotland. So that's the kind of most recent geological time in Scotland. A bit about Scottish mammoths, a bit about other Scottish extinct megafauna, and then a little look very briefly at other species that may well have been in Scotland, but which we just don't have any evidence for. And then we'll look a bit at some of the Holocene extinctions. So that's extinctions from the past 10,000 years. And then there'll be time at the end for questions too. So I'm Ross. I'm only sort of kind of a paleontologist. My background is molecular biology. So I work mostly in paleogenetics. So that's looking at ancient DNA. So that's DNA from old dead things. And my specialism within that specialism is looking at the phylogeny, so the cats, particularly the big cats. So things like lions, sabretooths, what else? Lynx is something I've looked at a bit. Cheetahs, pumas, pretty much every kind of big cat you can think of. There's extinct forms or extinct populations of which I've looked at. I've published about just over 50 scientific papers. I've written a book on Ice Age animals. So the Ice Age, the Pleistocene, extinction, these are all things that I'm really, really interested in, and have taken that outside of kind of academia to try and share my enthusiasm with anyone that will listen, essentially. And some other things I'm involved with are a blog, which is devoted to Ice Age animals and discussions of them and why they're so interesting. And then I've also recently started in the past year with some friends a podcast called Screens of the Stone Age, where we look at depictions of prehistory in film. So things like anything from Jurassic Park to California Man and everything in between. So, I mean, it's fair to say that, you know, I love the Ice Age, I love Pleistocene, I love mammoths, I love all these things. And so that's what's really drawn me from a kind of molecular biology lab-based world into a more kind of paleogeology kind of world. So that's me. And so when we kind of talk about where are all the Scottish mammoths, what we need to know, first of all, is what was happening in Scotland during the Ice Age. And by the Ice Age, we generally mean kind of the Pleistocene, which is the period from about 2.5 million to 10,000 years ago. And so here we have a kind of fairly simplified graph of temperature on Earth for the past 500 million years. And if we look to the Cenozoic, which is the period after the end of the Cretaceous, so the Paleocene, Eocene, all the way up to the Holocene, if we just concentrate on the Pleistocene, which is what kind of generally is meant by Ice Age, we can see that temperature hasn't been static. It's been very kind of dynamic. As a system, it's kind of veered wildly between pretty much what it is today, maybe even slightly warmer in times like the Eemian, about 100,000 years ago, to a lot colder, typically kind of Ice Age freezing conditions where it's been 4 or 5 degrees colder than it is today. And that's enough to set up a massive series of chain reactions, which will result in a much colder and drier planet. So I guess what I want to kind of really show from this is that when we talk about the Ice Age, we don't just mean a very static environment where everything's cold and everything's frozen and that's just it. It's a really dynamic time period where we have sort of oscillations between very, very cold to as warm as today. And essentially, the time period we're in just now, we're sort of still in the Ice Age. We're in a kind of interglacial period. So the past 10,000 years, the period known as the Holocene, we're still kind of subject to the same forces that caused these glacial oscillations during the Pleistocene. And so what this has also meant is that the geography itself of Europe, of the world, was different during the Ice Age. So we had, with these colder temperatures, when the glacials were in full effect, we would have had much larger ice caps, much larger glacial landforms as well. And so in Europe, particularly in the UK, what this means is that a lot of it was covered in ice, in glaciers, particularly Scotland, where we are now. By glaciers, it's almost impossible to imagine the volumes of ice we're talking about here. We're talking about tens of millions of tons of ice. We're talking about sheets, a mile plus thick, over where we're sitting right now. It was intense, but again, it was dynamic. So it wasn't just there all the time. It kind of pulsed. We had kind of nucleation sites where it would contain glaciers almost permanently, and then as temperatures became colder, the glaciers would spread out from the sources, and then as it became warmer, they would shrink back down again. And so for Britain, that kind of main nucleation site was over the kind of Western Highlands. So a few miles from where I am just now. I'm in Inverness at the minute. And the kind of expansion varied from between, the lowlands of Scotland right down to kind of the Midlands, and then sort of stopped at places in between as well. And while these glaciers are forming, all the water that's locked up in them actually lowered global sea levels. So you had parts of the Earth that are now submerged, which would have been dry land back in the heights of glaciation. So particularly the North Sea, that was a kind of wide open steppe land. The English Channel, these would have been dry land. You could have walked from Paris to London without getting your feet wet back maybe 50,000 years ago. And this is really how many species actually got to the UK just by walking. Britain wasn't an island back then. For most of the time, it was just a kind of peninsula, essentially. And we see evidence of this today when fishermen are trawling the North Sea, when they're using bottom trawlers to get flatfish. Very often they will take up fossils in the net. So you'll get mammoth tusks. They've had bits of Neanderthal from the bottom of the North Sea, saber-toothed cat, lions, hyenas, all sorts, even kind of human-made artifacts. So bone harpoons, bone points, things like that, get trawled up with the fish from the bottom of the North Sea, because until fairly recently, geologically speaking, this was open grassland where people lived, and animals too. So we've got a nice little reconstruction here of how that kind of dynamic oscillation of ice sheets would have looked like. So here we have the period about 40,000 years ago. The blue patches, which will expand, are the ice sheets, and the green is the land. So you can see at this point, most of Britain is ice-free and connected to mainland Europe, but there are some small kind of nucleation centres in the Western Highlands. And then as we go through time, these expand outwards and almost join up and then shrink back down again. So it's a very dynamic system, which is important to keep in mind throughout all of this. And if you think that's bad in terms of ice cover in Europe, then you've got to think as well that what was happening in the Americas, where essentially all of Canada was covered in two enormous ice sheets, the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets. And that did a couple of things. It kind of cut off the contiguous United States from the rest of the world for long periods of time. But it also exposed the Bering land bridge. So the space, the Bering Strait today, which is the kind of sea between Alaska and Russia, that was dry land, a kind of massive steppe grassland during some of the Ice Age as well. So when we were talking about the volumes of ice in glaciers, here's a nice cartoon from XKCD about what that would look like compared to modern skylines. So all of these kind of northern American cities would have been absolutely, covered in ice, enormous ice sheets that are, kilometers thick, which is incredible. So what this means for Britain and for Scotland as well is that for some of the time during the Ice Age, it would have looked a bit like this. So cold, dry, definitely, but full of life. So with mammoths, cave lions, reindeer, horses, woolly rhinos, just a whole kind of almost Serengeti-like ecosystem, a kind of natural food web, essentially, which has now totally disappeared. So it would have been mostly like this, but also sometimes like this. And you can see that very clearly in parts of the Highlands where the evidence of that glaciation is everywhere to be seen. I'm not a geologist, but if you ever hang around with them and take a visit to Scotland, then they'll be able to point out to you, how prevalent this kind of glacial evidence is. But what it was never like is what it's like today, where we don't have huge numbers of mammals roaming around Scotland, and we don't have huge ice sheets covering the land. What we have is a lot of nothing, essentially. A lot of bare hillsides and farmland with not really much going on, which is a totally new thing. This is not the norm. This is not the natural state of any land, essentially. We've had a complete inversion from what we had during the Ice Age, where 10,000, 20,000 years ago, you'd have total biomass being 99% wild animals and 1% humans. Whereas today you have 99% humans and their livestock and 1% wild animals. And this is really clearly shown by the kind of extinction patterns that we see. We have no mammoths, we have no woolly rhinos, we have no saber-toothed cats, we have no mastodons or giant sloths or giant wombats or elephant birds or all these other kind of really interesting exotic sounding megafauna. They've all gone from everywhere except Africa and sort of South Asia. And it depends who you speak to about why that's the case, but my strong contention is that it's mostly due to the spread of humans, modern humans, Homo sapiens, out of Africa and South Asia into the rest of the world, and encountering a kind of naive animal population that would have been easily hunted and had habitats that were easily modified as well. So to kind of bring that up to the present day, we still see the legacy of this in the population. So, the UK is now one of the most nature depleted countries on Earth. It's not that we don't have mammoths or cave lions or woolly rhinos. We also don't have wolves or bears or lynx or all these other kind of creatures that are found in the rest of Europe but aren't found in Ireland because we got rid of them, even within sort of recorded history. And even worse than that, when we look at the species that are around today, and bear in mind that our largest native mammal is the red deer, our largest native carnivore is the badger. 1 in 6 surveyed species are at risk of extinction. That's from the State of Nature report from this year. So, nature is not done very well in the UK, in Scotland, and it's only now that we're realizing how to fix that, which is something I'm also very, very interested in. But when we're talking about extinction, it's very well to bring up things like the wolf and the bear and the lynx and the beaver, all these things that have gone extinct fairly recently. But we tend not to think of woolly rhinos or hyenas or saber-toothed cats or giant deer as being native to Britain, and they are. It's really only a matter of kind of timescale as to why it is we think of some species as native and some as not. But it's something that we should keep in mind, definitely. Okay, so back to Scotland. We can really kind of answer the question now: where are all the Scottish mammoths? So I've talked to you a bit about this dynamic system of ice sheet expansion and contraction. Now, what this means is that if you become a fossil, if you're a mammoth that was going about its life, died, and left its bones behind, then unfortunately, you're going to be crushed under all of this in Pleistocene Scotland. We don't have very many cave systems, which would have kind of protected bones like we find in northern England and southern England and Wales. We don't have many bones from cave sites, and anything that was buried in open ground will have been turned into dust. And so, let me just make that a bit more kind of graphic for you. All the Scottish mammoths, they're here. They're just in microparticles in the kind of everyday dust that you'll find round and about, or kind of recycled into new things. Everything we've had is still being ground to dust by several billion tons of ice since the last ice age. that's why we have not very many Scottish mammoths, but we do have some, and they are rarer than hen's teeth, but we do have a little bit of mammoth stuff that's kind of made it through. Here's two examples of actual Scottish mammoths. So this is one from Greenhole Quarry, which was found in 1819. It's been radiocarbon dated to about 27,000 years ago. And we've also got one here from Clifton Hall Estate, which is about 29,000 years old. And that was found in 1820. And it's an interesting story about the Clifton Hall mammoth tusk. So when it was found, it was actually sold for £2, which you can imagine back in 1820 was quite a lot of money, for carving. So mammoth tusks are the same as elephant tusks. They're made of ivory, and they are used for carving. And in fact, there's a huge market today for mammoth ivory because it is legal to carve it, whereas elephant ivory is illegal. And so we can debate the merits of how good that is, but every year people go into the permafrost of Russia and Alaska to search for mammoth tusks to sell to the ivory market, and it's all perfectly legal. But yeah, it's a market that's been going on for hundreds of years. And back in 1820, when the Clifton Hall mammoth tusk was found, it was quite big. It was several feet long, and it was cut into different bits. Sold for £2. They tried to recover it, but some bits of it are still missing. So if you happen to chance upon something that looks a bit like a mammoth tusk that's in some obscure country house or some random small museum's collection, then maybe you might be the lucky person that puts it back together, and we can have a bit more complete mammoth tusk from Scotland. So there are only about 10 sites are mammoths known from in Scotland, compared to dozens from England. And interestingly, all of the remains until very, very recently were tusks and teeth. No bones were known about, which makes sense. I mean, tusks and teeth are stronger than bones. They're made of enamel and cementum, and they tend to kind of last a bit better than bones. Mammoths are cool. I mean, we all love mammoths, probably because we know so much about them. We've got mummies of them. So here's a few examples of mammoth mummies. We've got Dima, who was found in 1977, really well preserved. We've got the Yukagir mammoth head, which is an adult. Dima's a baby calf. It's an adult female. It's got the tusks. You can see the ears, the eyes, everything. Here we've got Luba, who was found in the 2000s, so fairly recently. I went on a tour. She was in Natural History Museum for a while. And we've got Yuka, who's another baby elephant, baby mammoth calf. It's weird that well, not weird, but it seems to be that most of the mammoth mummies we have are from calves, probably because they can freeze a lot faster when they die, and that helps to preserve them. Whereas the larger mammoths, they have, they ferment essentially. They have the bodies act as massive kind of microbial brewing chambers with all the bacteria that are in their stomachs. They cool down very slowly because of their bulk, and so mammoth adults aren't very common, but calf mummies are quite common. And we found, quite a few of them, more than any other Ice Age mammal, I think. And yeah, they've all got really cute names like Chroma and Luba and all these other things. But they're really fascinating and tell us a lot. And there's nothing quite like looking into the eyes of an extinct creature, which you can do with mammoths because of these mummies. But we also have other bits of evidence about mammoths, so that we know what they were like. So cave art is a really interesting one. We have lots of cave art of mammoths. This is mammoths that were drawn by people who lived with them, people who saw them, people who observed their behaviors really accurately. And so we can see really interesting stuff here. Top left, this is a mammoth painted in Rouffignac Cave in France. Really accurate. So one thing that you can notice is the trunk has a very distinct two fingers on the tip. And that has been confirmed in mummies of mammoths as well. So that's nice. We have even carvings of mammoth. Here's a carving from Vogelherd Cave in Germany, made of mammoth ivory. So here you have a mammoth made of mammoth. A really small tactile object. Obviously somebody's pride and joy. But we have also slightly darker evidence of human interaction with mammoths. At the bottom left here, we have some mammoth scapula, so shoulder blades, from a site called Yana in northern Siberia. And what's interesting about this is one site which has a lot of mammoth bone there, and these two shoulder blades both have flint projectile points still embedded in them. So these are mammoths that were hunted by humans. And fortunate for us, people that study them, they've left behind evidence of that in these bits of stone tip that are still stuck in the bone 15,000 years later. So, humans hunted mammoths. They were very good at it. We know that from lots of evidence, cut marks on bones, examples of projectile points still embedded there. And you have to think again how rare this kind of evidence is going to be. For every, however many 100 mammoths you hunt, only one or two are going to be struck in such a way that the flint blade breaks off in the bone. So yeah, a bit of a kind of mixed history between humans and mammoths, and definitely I would say we're the ultimate cause for why they're not around anymore. But I said just a couple of slides ago that we didn't have any bones of mammoths from Scotland, but that changed in 2018 when something really interesting happened at Loch Ryan. So Loch Ryan's just down here where this arrow is pointing. And a guy called Nick Coombe was walking along the beach there, and he spotted this, which was going to make you stop and look, if anything is. And he reported this find, and it's been analysed, and it is the first Scottish mammoth bone. It's a bit of leg bone, and it's probably come from somewhere under the Irish Sea and been washed up. So like the North Sea, like the Bering Strait, parts of the North Sea during the Ice Age would have been open grassland and would have been full of mammoth bones as well. And so we've just been lucky enough that one of them is washed up. This happens, I guess, more often down in places like East Anglia. So if you go to somewhere like Cromer or Maitland or Kessingland, people are finding bones that have been washed up from the North Sea all the time there. But it doesn't happen so often in the north. So this is a really cool find. And here's Nick with his mammoth bone, looking intuitively pleased, as he should be. And so here we have from 2018 the very first Scottish mammoth bone. Very rare, very cool. And well, it's just a bit of a stupid slide essentially, but some people have claimed that this monster original sightings were of circus elephants taking a swim in the River Ness and Loch Ness. As an Invernessian myself, I don't quite buy it, but wouldn't it be cool if mammoths were here the whole time and it just adapted to an underwater life? And that's what we're seeing, and that's what's funding the Highland Tourist Board. Anyway, let's move on from that. So that's about Scottish mammoths. Other Scottish megafauna, there's really not much, in fact, very little at all. We have Irish elk or shelk, the megaloceros, the giant deer, and we have woolly rhino, Stelodonta antiquitatis. And so where we have these guys, we've got 3 sites with the Irish elk. We've got a site on Elles, we've got a site on the River Cree, which produced an Irish elk antler, and we've got the site of Maybole down here, which produced a skull with antlers. So if you don't know what the Irish elk looked like, it's confusing because it's not exclusively Irish and it's not actually an elk. It's a pan-European giant deer, most closely related to the fallow deer. And you can sort of see that in the shape of the antlers. It has these large palmate antlers like fallow deer and also a bit like moose, but it's bigger and heftier than a moose, the biggest deer that ever lived, essentially. And it has these enormous 13-foot wingspan antlers, which are massively impressive. Here's an example on display in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. That's my eldest daughter there for size comparison. And they're really, really beautiful, impressive animals. This skull over here, this is the one that was found in Maybole. So this is now in the Hunterian in Glasgow. Also a very impressive pair of antlers. And we know quite a lot about what the megaloceros looked like when it was alive. We have really good, nice reconstructions. But these are all based on the cave art. Here's a really nice image from Cognac Cave in France. You can see the massive palmate antlers, this big kind of open area of antler with the tines pointing backwards and forwards. And the interesting things to note is how low down the head is held and how huge this kind of bump is on the back of the neck. That's to support all the muscles to keep that massive rack of antlers up in the air. So it needs a lot of muscle, like bison do, and other kind of large antlered or horned animals, just to support the head. We're talking, 20 or 30 kilos of antler that has to be kept up. So it's a big weight. We have other cave sites as well that have Megaloceros. There's 2 examples from Chauvet and another one from Cognac. And what's really interesting is we get some insight into what the coloration of the animal was. It seems to have had a dark colored hump. Here we have Megaloceros from Chauvet. Here's one from Cognac, and they both have this darkened color on the hump and lines radiating outwards from the hump, which is not a coloration pattern that we find in any deer or really any other mammal today, which is quite interesting. And yeah, these are hugely impressive fossils. It used to be that they're hugely common in Ireland. That's why it's called the Irish elk. But it used to be that you could find them by prospecting and selling them on. So this is how they used to do prospecting for Irish elk. They'd take a huge long pole and sort of stick it down in through the peat, through the gravel, through the clay, and then when they kind of knocked against the bones of the Irish elk, they'd know to dig down and pick them up. And this still sort of happens today. Top right is a picture of a guy who was fishing in a loch, and up with his catch came a big male skull with antlers of an Irish elk. You find them all over the place. There's hundreds of them. Even in Scotland, you can see them in the Natural History Museum in Edinburgh, in the Hunterian. I was in the Kincraig Wildlife Park recently, and they've got 2 skulls in their cafe on the walls, which is quite nice. So they're hugely impressive animals, and so impressive that they've actually been on our stamps as well. Here's a nice stamp of Megaloceros that came out a few years back. And here's another fairly amusing, I think, cartoon about why the Irish elk became extinct. It's probably not this. Again, I think humans have a hand in it. Funnily enough, Irish elk actually survived quite late. They survived into the Holocene in parts of the Urals, even as late as maybe the early Neolithic, late Mesolithic. But they go extinct in Britain at the end of the Pleistocene, so about 13,000 years ago, probably due to human influence and maybe also partly due to climate as well. So for the next bit of megafauna, the last of the sort of 3 megafauna that we find in Scotland, the woolly rhino, we only know it from 2 sites, Surley in Argyll, I think, and from Bishopbriggs, now part of Glasgow. And we have a few bones. These are the actual bones that have been found in Scotland, the woolly rhino. We've got a milk tooth from a baby and a leg bone fragment as well. So not very much, really. All of the rest must have been ground to dust. But woolly rhinos, again, another interesting charismatic species. We do have some mummies of them. There's an example of the only complete adult woolly rhino mummy that's been found. We don't really know why they're so much more uncommon than mammoths, but there's only been 4 or 5 mummies found. Most of them have been from calves or partial mummies. A nice reconstruction in the bottom there. And again, we have lots of cave art woolly rhinos. These are all examples from Chauvet Cave in France. And they show, these guys were great observers. We can see here's 2 rhinos fighting. Here we can see an example which maybe shows what the coloration of the animal was like, with this kind of darker patch in the middle. I do like the image at the bottom right, which seemed to show a happy gambling rhino with his enormous horns right there. And we have even going right back, this is the second ever rhino mummy that was found. It was found in, let me just check my notes, 1877. The second one ever found. You can still see it today in the St. Petersburg Museum in Russia. The first one, the first woolly rhino mammoth, the first woolly rhino mummy that was found in 1799, and bits of it were cut off, the feet and the head, and sent to Peter Simon Pallas, who's a very famous naturalist period. And he was able to identify them as rhino, which not many people living in Europe at that time would have been able to do. But unfortunately, he was so keen to preserve the remains that he got sent that he tried to dry them out in the oven. And they were so well preserved that they actually burnt. And so we don't have that well preserved original woolly rhino mummy head anymore because it got crisped by Peter Simon Pallas, which is a huge shame. Other mummies of woolly rhinos are known outside of the permafrost. So this is one that may be familiar to some people. This is in a cast of one in the Natural History Museum in London. This is from Starunia in the Ukraine, and this was not found in permafrost. This was found in ozozorite mine. Now, ozozorite is a kind of it's like a waxy mineral that's formed from petroleum, and so these guys have essentially been pickled. There's two complete pickled woolly rhino that have been found in Starunia and are now in a museum in Ukraine. This is a cast of one that's now in the Natural History Museum in London. But I do really like it. I mean, it's fantastic preservation, and the way they've mounted it, I always think makes it looks like it's just having a sleepy dream with its feet up in the air, thinking of running along the grassland or something. And recently we found possibly the best preserved woolly rhino mummy. This is one called Sasha, which was found in 2015, I think. Yes, 2015, which is another calf. So for the same reason that mammoth calves tend to be better preserved as mummies than adults, the same seems to be true for woolly rhinos. And so this has been studied extensively and actually taxidermied. I haven't put a picture of the final taxidermy up because it does look pretty comical. This is it just after it was found, when it looks slightly more lifelike. The taxidermy is, yeah, you can seek it out for yourself if you want to, but it doesn't really have a lot of dignity, which I think this image does. So that's it. In terms of Scottish megafauna, all that's really not being found in dust, and by megafauna, I mean the large animals greater than 100 pounds or 44 kilos. But there's other ones that would probably have been here. We know that they're in northern England because they're preserved in cave sites there. Things like cave lion, cave hyena, leopard, cave bear, even saber-toothed cat. So these are all species that we find even up to Yorkshire. We found lions and hyenas in places like Kirkdale Cave. We have saber-toothed cat from southern England, but during time periods when Scotland wasn't covered in ice, these individuals would surely have ventured up as far north as we are. Okay, and so the very last site I'm going to talk about, I'm sort of slightly aware of the time, is one where really all the rest of our kind of fossils come from, which is Inchnaddamp, which is up here in Innocent, which is a really fascinating site and quite easily accessible if people ever wanted to visit. It's a kind of couple of hours drive from Inverness, and in good weather, it can be absolutely gorgeous. So Inchnaddamp, or Craignadoon, the Cave of the Bones, has lots and lots of bones. But it's really interesting because it has some of our last records of extinct species, which are still around, but not found in the UK anymore. So brown bear we have from Inchnaddamp. We have the very last dated brown bear, which is from about the 7th century BC. It's been radiocarbon dated. That's the very youngest one that we have from all of the UK. It has polar bear, our only Scottish record of polar bear. There's only about 3 records of polar bear from the UK as a whole, so that's really important. Probably late Pleistocene from during the glacial times when it would have been able to access the northwest of Scotland by sea ice. We have a lot of reindeer from the site. In fact, we have the youngest reindeer in Scotland, in the UK from this site, which is only from about 6,300 BC. And it looks like this site was actually a kind of reindeer calving den. So we find lots of antlers from female reindeer and lots of antlers, or lots of bones, sorry, from young, very young reindeer calves. So reindeer are interesting in that they're, I think, the only deer species where the males and the females have antlers. The females keep theirs for most of the year, but when they're shed, that's diagnostic. They can tell that their shapes are different between males and females. And so it looks like that based on the bones that are preserved at Inchinadam, this was where reindeer came for thousands of years. So we have dates from 40,000, 30,000, and 10,000 years, showing that they were around and calving here. We have lynx from Inchinadam. Lynx are incredibly rare in the fossil record. In fact, the second youngest lynx in the UK as a whole is from Inchinadam. It comes out at about 300 AD. So, pretty recent. I think the youngest is from Kinsey Cave in Yorkshire, and it's from about the 7th, 8th century. And that's it. So very rare in the fossil record. This evidence is really cool because it shows that lynx were around even up to medieval times. So post Roman invasion, lynx were around, which wasn't really known until a couple of decades ago when they did sort of more research on dating these bones. And I think that gives, it's really interesting when that sort of feeds into questions of rewilding and reintroduction. Lynx aren't here not for any kind of climatic reason. There was nothing going on that would have caused them any bother. It's probably down to changing farmland use, cutting down forests and woodland as well. The lynx is a woodland creature. That's where it would have made its home. Doesn't do very well around lots of humans. So that's 3 of the youngest records for these kind of extinct species in the UK from this one cave site. It's incredibly special. We also have wolf from there, which is not a hugely common fossil in Scotland, an Arctic fox, again, which is from about the same time as the polar bear, when conditions were much more glacial, much colder. But Arctic fox would have been at home here too. So yeah, a very special site. Here's what it looks like. It's got the path, you can go right up to it. There's 3 main cave sites and a few other smaller cave sites as well. And it's incredible to think that not too long ago, geologically speaking, could have seen reindeer herds here, and lynx and wolves and bears. And here's just some of the fossils from that site. So we have bottom right, we have the polar bear skull. That's it right there. Top right, we have the lynx skull from Inchinadam. Over on the left, we have some more lynx bones. So these are, I think, a femur and another limb bone. And then down here, number 3, that's a tooth from a brown bear from Inchinadam. So yeah, really, really important fossil site, which not an awful lot of people really know about, but is incredibly important in our understanding of extinction processes in Britain. And here's a couple of bits of reindeer antler from Inchinadam as well. So I mean that's sort of it, I think, really, in terms of Scottish mammal fossils from the Pleistocene and early Holocene, extinct mammals anyway, extinct in our country. There's some others which I haven't really had time to go into. I really want to just kind of give a flavour of what's been happening. But we do have fossils in Scotland from moose, which may have been around till quite late. Moose have very distinctive antlers. Here's one from Wigtonshire. It's down here. They may have been around very late. Apparently, there's a Gaelic word for moose, which you wouldn't really expect unless they overlapped, which is interesting. Wild horse, aurochs, boar, beaver, these are all native to Scotland, and we have fossil evidence for them at various sites around the country. And because they went extinct so much later than things like mammoths and woolly rhinos, we have a lot more evidence for them because they were around longer and they weren't crushed under miles of ice. So I think that's really all I want to say about kind of Cenozoic mammals. I would maybe just try and give a plug for my book. If you like learning about extinct mammals from Britain, then I've tried to give as much information as I can about all the different species that I find interesting in the book, which is still available at bookshops. And yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you.